Let's start talking a little more about block diagrams. This is an example of a single channel mixer, and actually it's a Soundcraft 200B little live mixer console that you might use on a gig. So your microphone comes in here, you've got a line in here, say maybe for your synthesizer if you want, or you can use it for your microphone. And then you've got phantom power, which we'll discuss when we talk about mics, to power up the microphone if you want to use that. Then this little thing here is an amplifier block. Here's a variable resistor, which gives you a volume. So this is like a microphone mic pre. And then here is a filter block where you can filter the signal in terms of frequencies. So if you have a little rumble in your signal, you can insert that and it'll take the rumble away from it. Because if you're on a live stage, sometimes there's rumble from the sound system and so on and so forth. The next piece to look at is the insert. Now the insert is where you can send something off to a different piece of gear and bring it back into the channel. So if you wanted to go and insert a compressor or some other manipulation of your sound, you could do that. This next block is a 3-band equalizer, a low frequency, mid frequency, and high frequency adjustment. Then you go to gain, go to panning. Moving to the right, you go to auxiliary sends, and it shows you here on the stabs where the auxiliary sends go, whether they're pre or post. Pre meaning pre-fader or post-fader. If it's post-fader, then whatever you send on this auxiliary is going to follow the level that you set on your gain here. If it's pre, then it comes from the segment that's before the gain happens and is not adjusted by the gain. Now you say, well, why would you need pre and post? Do you see here after you EQ, you've got a gain control with a variable resistor. So that's how loud your microphone, if you plugged a mic in, is going to be. So your trim here at the front end is your microphone level preamp. Then here is your gain, your output level of how loud it's going to be going to your PA. It is the fader. The trim knob on a board, like a real board, the trim knob up top, which is the microphone level, and then the fader is the gain as to how much comes out of that path. Now, why would you need pre or post sends? Because there's going to be a send module to send off to other things. So the pre, like let's say you're working in a record studio environment, and the mixer has multiple channels like this, and he's mixing different sound elements to make it sound right for him in the control room, but you're in the other room with headphones on. He can set up the send of each sound element to go to your headphones before the adjustment that he's making in the control room. So your headphone mix won't change, but he can change the mix in the control room. So use a pre-fader send for that, and a post-fader send when you're sending to, say, a reverb and you want to fade something up, you want to send more to the reverb, and you want it to track whatever the gain is on your fader. But you walk into a real studio and you see a board. Like in my studio, I've got an actual board. 48 inputs, and it's a real thing. So up top here, you've got a knob, and that's where your microphone comes in. Little block diagram. So this is your mic pre. Now the mic preamp brings it up to the normal operating level in the studio, which is actually line level. Microphones are quieter than when you send a signal from piece of gear to piece of gear. It's usually the normal operating signal in a studio is considered line level, and they standardize all the levels between all the gear so that you don't have one piece of gear quieter than the next and receiving signals that are quieter or louder. The basic concept in the studio where you've got 20, 30, 40 pieces of gear is that when you send a signal from one piece of gear to the next, whether it's an equalizer, a compressor, or in the old days it was a tape machine, nowadays it could be the Pro Tools rig, and then back, and then manipulate it and cue it and pan it, and then send it to your amplifier, and then send it to your speakers. All of those levels, except from the amplifier to your speakers, is line level, and except from your microphone to your mic preamp, because the microphone's quieter, so the mic preamp is a special amplifier to bring it up to the normal operating level in the studio, which is line level. From your amplifier to your speakers has to get much more power to drive the speakers to move the air. But everything else between those 2 points is operating at line level, which is your normal or nominal operating level in the studio, and that helps you transfer signals from one piece of gear to the next. That's really what's super important in a recording studio environment, is when you can go from the mic pre to the compressor to the EQ and not lose signal or gain signal. It should all be the same level. It's kind of the same concept is in your computer when you take something off your hard drive, long-term memory, put it in RAM, short-term memory, process it, the working brain of the computer, send it back to RAM, and then send it back to long-term memory. All of that data transfers that happen inside your computer have to be done at a specific rate so you don't overwhelm the RAM or underwhelm the RAM, or don't try to write too much data to the hard drive too quickly or too little. So all of those rates of transfer determine how accurately information moves from one segment to the next. Same thing in an analog environment where you're talking about analog sound signals going from one piece of gear to the next. So we're going to talk about that transfer rate and how you get the best transfer from piece of gear to the next piece of gear. So we go to a mic pre. The next section is usually an EQ of some sort. So you've got like a high, mid, low frequency adjustments. And the next segment might be what they call auxiliaries. Auxiliary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now these auxiliaries are ways of sending the signal that's going down this path to a whole nother place, to an amplifier and then maybe to a set of headphones. And you imagine each one of these has a different sound on it. You can take and set up your own mix that goes to the headphones that's independent of what's going down this path. When I say pre, that means if you make it pre, fader, next stage is your panning, usually going left or right, and mutes and solos, so you can cut the signal or just solo that signal, and then of course your fader. And then all of this joins up with all the other guys, and it goes to your stereo mix, and then this sends off to an amplifier which goes to your speaker, and you also send it off to some device that captures stereo mix of all of these elements put together into stereo, sends it off and captures it into a left and right. And then you take that tape and you go to the manufacturer and go, make me records out of that. So basically this is some simple signal flow of what happens in a real studio in terms of the board. Question?
Yeah, can you go back to auxiliary?
Yes. What they are basically is there are auxiliaries that send whatever signal's coming through here, whether it's your vocal mic, sends it out of the chain that's passing through this way and goes to other things that you can use. The most prime example of this is, let's say, are you a vocalist? Okay, let's talk about vocals. That'll make it really hit home. So you're singing, you go through your mic pre, you EQ it so you sound really good. You're adjusting more level here, which goes out here to your speaker so you can hear yourself, right? And then you say, gee, I really would like a little reverb on this. How do I do that? Well, you could insert a reverb in the insert and send it back, or you could say, I'm not going to do it on the insert. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take send 6 here. I'm going to send it off to a piece of gear, which is my reverb, right? So now the signal's still passing through here clean with no reverb, but it's also now going out send 6, depending on how much you adjust you want to send to it, right? You can send a little, send more, send a lot. Goes to the reverb, and then the reverb actually can come back in to an unused channel strip and call it your rev return, reverb return. And then this blends together based upon how you make your faders with your non-reverb vocal. This is all reverb vocal. You can blend how much you like, how little you like, and then it combines into stereo, goes to your final mix. This is all signal flow that you do in the studio. You also do it in your computer. Computer's a lot easier than in the studio because you don't have outboard pieces of gear. It's all plugins. So if I wanted to do this in Pro Tools, instead of going like this, I would just set up my rev return and put my reverb plugin on that channel and set this up to receive from aux 6. Right? And I don't have to go through this rigmarole of going to outboard pieces of gear and so on. In a real studio with outboard gear, they had all these patch bays, and you've got little patch cables just like telephone operators used to do. Telephone operators used to say, okay, Steve wants to talk to Joe. So Steve goes over to Joe, right? And so you can go ahead and reconfigure anything you want. So if you didn't want to use this reverb, you could use the other reverb. You know, depending on what the studio had, maybe 4 or 5 different reverbs that have different qualities. So all of those things are configurable where they have the patch bay where you can go ahead and decide, hey, I'm engineering today and I really want to use this piece of gear and this piece of gear and this is how I want to do it, and you tell the second engineer, and when you walk in, everything's all patched up the way you want it. That's what the patch bay is used for. In Pro Tools, it's much easier because you can configure it however you want as you build your session. In Pro Tools, you can have 1 input or you can have 500 inputs, depending on what you want. You can have 1 send, you can have 25 sends. I mean, all of this stuff is configurable because it's all software. But in the real studio, you had certain limitations, and you had certain size of boards and certain amount of reverb sends, certain amount of outboard gear. And so the trick was, how do I utilize the gear I have in the most effective way to get the kind of sound I want to get? And we'll get to what EQs do and how they do it. We'll get to how compressors work. I keep using those terms because those are pieces of gear that manipulate sound. Okay, so we're talking big block diagrams. That's what this is.